Another aspect of this is where we strongly view the role of visualization, as an enabler for more effective decision support, or in the interpretation of these various coupled models. So what I like to do is illustrate a couple of examples, or an example of this from some past experience, so with some lessons learned. So a number of years ago, we, and these are supposed to be animated. They're not. All right, well, this was tested before, but okay. So what I was going to show you, I'll have to just describe. A number of years ago, we worked with the Center for Operations in the city government of Rio de Janeiro. So this is an organization responsible for emergency management. And one of the things that they were concerned about was flooding induced by strong convective events. A number of major events that led to loss of life was among the motivations. And one of the problems was that the typical information that's tossed over the fence was not adequately scaled to the needs of the decision maker. So we worked with the city government to try to understand their requirements. We put together a sort of a limited coupled system where we ran a numerical weather prediction model at 1 kilometer resolution, and then used to drive that a very simple overland flow model for flood prediction. There was not a lot of local data available at that time, but we did have a high resolution DEM that from LiDAR scan at 1 meter resolution. And to first order, the primary problem in this city was essentially gravity-driven flow. So you'd have large storms, they would drop intense rainfall over areas with very high terrain, and you basically had just the flooding driven down the mountains. So we implemented a very simple surface runoff model, but at high resolution, to try to have estimates of water level. And the idea here, though, is that we worked with the city government, but it was still implemented in a very static way. Over a period of months, we would refine the models, put them in operation, get feedback, but it's a slow, laborious process, and no direct feedback except back to the model development team for the implementation. And that ultimately is a problem. Second problem is that these models, we were given the technology, we could only run them in a deterministic way. So our ability to capture the uncertainty in the models was limited. A third characterization was a lack of sufficient local near real-time data in order to assimilate the models to improve their mission conditions. So these raised a number of the issues that we try to understand in terms of how we would address these matters moving forward. And the other aspect of this, though, is that we did try to go from looking at the flooding to try to understand, begin to estimate information. So that one is in. All right. So yeah, actually, now I understand why there are different codecs embedded in the PowerPoint. But, not to be too geeky about that. So one of the things that we then did was look at traffic flow. And this was an agent-based model, not a statistical or physics-based model. And we used the output of the flooding model to try to drive that. So the idea to begin to connect water level estimates into a form that could be usable by a decision maker worrying about changing traffic patterns in light of a potential event. And this starts to make a stronger connection between the meteorology to something that's more of direct use by emergency managers. So let me stop at this point and turn it back over to Chris. So thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. And I'm sure if people want to see the animation, because I'm sure it was really cool, Lloyd will be able to show it to you on a laptop or something outside.
I can do that. Thank you.
Okay, so next up is Brian. So the next slide is going to be showed by Brian Colin from Stony Brook. Brian is a professor and the director of the Atmospheric Science Division at the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. He's also the faculty director of the University Scholars Honours Program at Stony Brook. He served on the New York City Panel for Climate Change for the past few years. His research is concerned with mountain meteorology, coastal meteorology, numerical weather prediction, and regional climate. He also utilizes global and regional atmospheric models to investigate how extreme weather may change over the northeast US over the next century. So, right. I bet not touch.
Okay. Well, that's loading up. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation here to be on this panel here today. Yeah, I have a few slides, which we were instructed to do, so I feel a little guilty that everyone has slides, but I spent a little time on it. I do have an animation, if it works, who knows, at the end, and so forth. Anyhow, the cover slide that I have is not a flooding event, but some of you may recognize. It's from a year ago in New York City. We had a snow event in mid-November, the first of the season. It wasn't a blizzard, it was just 5 or 6 inches, but it occurred during rush hour. It was a challenging forecast, needless to say, but this is the type of event I think that motivates sort of why we're here, because it encompasses the predictability challenges, it encompasses the tools that we need for better communication, and all of the above and so forth. So this is a winter case, but in the next few slides I do want to highlight some of the work that I've been involved with. I started in the field basically as a pure meteorologist, so to speak. I mainly just studied mountain meteorology and storms. But I must say in the last several years it's been very enjoyable for me to collaborate with a number of different groups in different fields on this difficult problem. So I wanted to show you a couple examples that I've been involved with. And once again, just like Lloyd, I have this very busy thing here. But this is just this is a project that really was eye-opening to me. This was an NSF Hazard Seas project for several years. The University of Delaware, the Disaster Research Institute, led with Rachel Davison. But I'm way at the top. I'm basically providing war funds. This is basically to help emergency managers and stakeholders with evacuations for hurricanes. Basically getting people out of harm's way. And so this was an attempt to put the physical modelers together with the storm surge, the inland flooding, and my atmospheric to provide hazard inputs and a bunch of scenarios, and I'll show you an example in a second, that can eventually be put into an evacuation model that takes into account traffic and resident behavior and so forth. So it's and ultimately, it's supposed to provide recommendations to help days in advance as a storm is approaching. And so, this is an example of in the National Science Foundation trying to bring people together to tackle this difficult problem. So here's just a quick example from Florence of last year. And so I'm running the WRF model, atmospheric model at a few kilometer grid spacing, providing an ensemble, these tracks that you see in the upper left. And so forth. So there's a bunch of scenarios 4 days out when you see the beginning here, and so anything's possible in some sense. And so the goal is, as we're getting closer to the event, we're basically narrowing down the options in these colors to certain scenarios. And I should mention that these scenarios are updated every 12 hours as new model guidance comes in and so forth. So what you see is just one set of scenarios. But ultimately, each one of these scenarios is run through the hazard models. It's also run through the evacuation models to provide the risk and travel times, and ultimately in the lower right, the evacuation areas and so forth. So basically, this tool is supposed to mimic, in some sense, or help emergency managers help integrate all this information. And it's a ton of information, right? This is why it's so challenging, because right, they have to deal with the past hurricane evolution. I can't read this, but basically the forecast uncertainty, time left until landfall, and then the time to evacuate people, all these factors. And so these tools are coming online. They're running a research mode now, but I think we're getting close to the point where we can start thinking about this, at least in terms of quasi-operations with that. The other, Lloyd mentioned the importance of visualization. At Stony Brook, we also have a visualization center called the Reality Deck by Professor Ari Kaufman. I was involved with this with Hurricane Sandy, post-mortem, looking at flooding in New York City. What's unique about this is users are in this room, which is basically has hundreds of displays. It's motion sensitive, so users can point at the screen and get information just with their hand gestures and things like that. And there's all kinds of socio-demographic information on the screen that they can look at related to these various areas in the city and so forth. So it's interactive. And so I think this is important. Usually what happens though is we're here, with past storms, is that we're always looking at past events, but I'm really optimistic for a tool like this to be used looking at sort of virtual reality for future storms, considering sea level rise, what are the what-if scenarios, putting yourself in the situation of a storm that may impact a major city that hasn't happened yet, right? Usually we're thinking about after the fact, but there's an opportunity to use these kind of tools with the models to really home in on thinking about the future, which will help with planning, of course. The last example I have is taking into account that the technology, the observations have really improved. The New York Mesonet is a fantastic resource here up here at Albany led. At Stony Brook we have some new radar technology that we're testing out in the field to also help, and let me see if I can animate this, but this is a phased array radar. So usually the operational radars of the Weather Service, you'll see the upper right jump every few minutes. This is a convective storm event. But now with a phased array, you're getting 120-degree sector scan, but updated every few seconds. So now you actually have information about the flooding event and the rainfall event, an unprecedented resolution, which will be useful to feeding into flooding models and also for model data assimilation and things that we've been struggling with because the temporal resolution has been very coarse. There's actually a little bit of AI in this because the little flashes in the black triangles are lightning strikes from the GOES satellite, and we're actually pointing the RHI, the cross-section, relative to those lightning strikes. So you can actually program the radar to sample where you want to sample. And that's where the user comes in, because maybe the AI or whatever can basically mimic where the user wants the data to be for their particular need. Anyhow, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, now screen's going to go up.
Oh, yeah.
So the panelists want to come up now. It's a long way up then. So, Jenny is back on the stage, and let me give you a little bit of introduction while the screen keeps rising. So Jenny is a professor of meteorology and atmospheric science at Penn State University. She's the director of Penn State's Institute for Cyber Science and the centennial president of the American Meteorological Society in 2019. Jenny's research interests span hurricane evolution from genesis over tropical Africa or in the subtropics, the exotropical transition of hurricanes, which is relevant to Sandy, interactions between hurricanes and climate, including climate change, factors impacting the maximum intensity and structure of hurricanes, improving numerical weather prediction forecast, catastrophic risk modeling. Jenny's also a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and was elected to its council in 2005. So I'll pass it over to you, Jenny, for your comments.
So you'll be glad to know I'm not going to repeat anything from this morning, but instead I want to tell you a little story that relates to an extreme weather event that was to do with water, although I'm not focusing explicitly on the flooding. And then I want to think about a little bit about how we can use AI in this context. So in December 25th, 1974, when most of you weren't born, Tropical Cyclone Tracy made landfall in Darwin, Australia. If you look at Australia and you look at the very top coastline in the middle, that's roughly where Darwin is. It's far from everywhere. And half the city was wiped out. And so it's so far from everywhere that how do we deal with this critical emergency? And so, you know, you take a very systematic engineering approach, which is what the people who were not typically emergency managers were sent in to do. They were military. And they evacuated everyone except 10,000 people. They figured they needed that 10,000, mainly men, to rebuild the city. This had unintended consequences, which is that about 50% of those who were evacuated didn't return. So that completely changed the entire character of the city, and it resulted in dislocation of many of that population, some of whom had, you know, millennia of roots in that region. And so that idea of the unintended consequences, when we don't get our decision-making processes sort of fully rooted in what's the information people know in order to make the decisions that are critical at the time, I think is something we definitely need to think about, and how they make decisions and what's motivating them. So back in 1974, there was no email, there was no internet. On Christmas Day, there was a skeleton media crew, so the media weren't even on top of this thing, and the telephones were out. So information was definitely at a dearth. Well, now we don't have that problem. Now when we have an event, we have a lot of information, but again, the question is, how do we make use of that information? And I think many people are looking at AI, artificial intelligence, as one of the key tools we can use. And again, we have to use that wisely, because we have to be thinking about the unintended consequences of the data we select and the data we ignore.
Okay, thank you. I'll stay with you. Thank you, Jenny. So, actually, we're moving along now. So, now I'd like to welcome Rebecca Morse from NCAR. Rebecca is a senior scientist at NCAR, which stands for the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in Boulder, where she's also Deputy Director of the Mesoscale and Microscale Meteorology Laboratory. She's an expert in weather forecasting systems and risk communication, with an emphasis on high-impact weather, including hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes. Her current research foci include the communication and interpretation of weather risks, the use of weather-related information in decision-making, and weather hazard prediction and predictability, all central to this discussion. Rebecca.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to talk here today. This is really exciting for me to hear the discussions this morning and participate in this conference. I am trained formally as an atmospheric scientist, that's what my PhD is in, but for the last 25 years or more, I've been really trying to work at the interface of atmospheric science and societal needs, and so it's great to participate in this conference. So a few things I wanted to mention. One is kind of where we're at in the problem we're talking about today. I think we're at the intersection of different evolving streams of where we are in science and technology and society. The observations, as my colleagues have mentioned, and the capabilities to do modeling and predictive technology have led to dramatically improved forecasts over the last few decades, including more spatial and temporal detail regarding the weather and the hazards such as the winds and flooding and other kinds of hazards that it can produce. And so this has been a huge evolution in society of our ability to have this kind of information that's continuing to evolve rapidly. There's also been dramatic evolutions that we've all experienced in information communication technology in terms of how scientists and modelers can get information, and also in terms of how emergency managers and others can communicate with the public, and how members of the public can communicate with each other in disasters. So these two kind of evolving streams together are what we refer to as the modern information environment, and how that has really changed the landscape of weather prediction, weather information, and decision-making in disasters. At the same time, there's been a huge evolution in terms of the decisions that can be made as a disaster approaches with all this new information and communication technology. So people can make more complex decisions, and then they can get information further in advance, and this really extends the time frame of decision making And when you look at decision-making leading up to and during a disaster nowadays, it really starts, depending on the type of weather. For a hurricane, it might even be 2 weeks or longer in advance. And that, as the information changes, those decisions get updated and can change. So it's really this continuum of decisions and continuum of information that are intersecting. So based on my 20 or so years of experience in this area, I want to talk about 3 themes that I found throughout my work that I thought would be interesting in the context of this conference. The first is the importance of interactions across the disaster cycle. So a lot of the work that's being talked about in this conference really will focus on the response and recovery phase, which is really, really important. And those decisions made in those phases of a disaster strongly intersect with the decisions that are made before an event. So in the mitigation phase, and then also as the event is approaching, and there are forecasts of those kinds of events, which there are nowadays for meteorological type events. My research and my work focuses a lot on those pre-event decisions, and they're important both for reducing the impacts of the disaster and then also for setting up the kinds of decisions people can make in the response and the recovery phase. So the more information you can get before the event about what could happen and what kinds of things might happen, the more you can do what people talked about in the session this morning, preparing the right kinds of activities so you're not scrambling as much afterwards. So that's really important. And so improved prediction and communication, decision-making in the pre-event phase can really set up individuals and communities and society as best as possible for the most effective post-event response and recovery. Another theme that's come up across my research is the theme of uncertainty, and predictive uncertainty is unavoidable because the future hasn't happened yet. And there are reasons specifically in weather prediction and hazard prediction why that's the case, going back to chaos theory and so on, why there's unavoidable uncertainty. And that uncertainty evolves as an event approaches. So a lot of research focuses on quantifying uncertainty and reducing uncertainty. But it's also important to know that uncertainty evolves, and as an event gets closer, the uncertainties start to look different. You might be able to narrow in on what areas might be affected and what hazards might be occurring in those areas, and then as the event gets even closer, you might be able to be more specific about the locations and times and so on. And that really intersects with decision making, and so a lot of my work is focused on that. And what I hear now a lot is about the gap between information that's available in the weather prediction community and what people who are making decisions get and can use. So I've heard about different kinds of situations recently where meteorologists might say, okay, several days in advance or a week in advance, we might know something, but we don't know how to communicate that because the uncertainty about what's going to happen is so great. At the same time, the decision makers, emergency managers, and others are seeking out extra information in those time frames. And so some of it is about how do you bridge that gap where the uncertainty is so high that it's difficult to have sort of pre-canned products where you can say this is what's going to happen in your area because there's so much uncertainty, and yet the decision makers are really using information, and they're not always getting the best information they can because the meteorologists don't know how to communicate it given that uncertainty. So that's really a place where the interactions between weather prediction and decision makers, like the kinds of things we're talking about in this panel, can help bridge that gap. And the last thing I wanted to mention that's come up throughout my work is the first study I did of emergency management decision-making in a weather event. The meteorologists were focused on providing better information, and the emergency manager talked with me about how important it was for him. That conversation he had with the forecaster was critically important for making decisions. And this theme keeps coming up over and over again, including some of the studies I've done in the last year or two, that no matter how good the meteorological information gets, often the decision maker wants to talk with a human to figure out what that information means, to be able to ask questions, and to gauge confidence. And so in talking with that human, what often happens is the forecaster or other information provider gives information, and the decision maker asks questions like, I need to make a decision about this, what's going to happen here, what can you tell me about this, and so on. And the expert will go to their data, or they'll kind of go into their head and kind of think about what they know and respond to that. And what the work we're talking about in this panel provides the capability to do is to not only rely on what's in the decision make in the forecaster's head, but for the forecaster to be able to say, oh, you want to know more about that? Let me go back and see if I can adapt my models or my observations or something else to provide better information on that specific thing that you're concerned about. So I think that's a really incredible potential evolution of the theme of this panel, is to go from the conversations that are so critical between the decision makers and the forecasters to actually having the forecasters be able to and the meteorologists be able to produce better information to advance those conversations. So we can come back and say, not just what's in my head, but now the models can tell you this, and what more do you need to know?
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And the final panelist that we're in is Rick Lutic from the University of North Carolina. He's an alumni distinguished professor of marine sciences and environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he also directs the Institute of Marine Sciences in the Department of Homeland Security's Coastal Resiliency Center of Excellence. He is a principal developer and user of the AdCirc circulation storm surge model that is widely used by the academic, government, and private sectors for coastal flood hazard assessments, mitigation design, forensics, and event-based forecasting. So, Rick.
Thank you. Well, I'm something out of water in one way, in that I'm a coastal engineer / physical oceanographer amongst meteorologists, but I'm pleased to be here because this clearly is a coupled problem. It's a collaborative problem, and so these opportunities to talk together about how to tackle this problem are very productive usually. As Chris mentioned, I predict flooding in the coastal zone, primarily from the ocean, but more and more from precipitation. And Harvey and Florence just most recently indicated how critical that is. But I'll give you another example in just a minute that we don't think about. It hasn't been as much in the mindset, but it's a similar issue that we worked on. Also, as Chris mentioned, much of the work that I've done with AdCirc over the years, or that the broader community has done, which is both in academia as well as the federal government and the private sector, has been in retrospective studies or forensic studies, and also in hazard assessments. So determining statistical risk or statistical hazard, they can then go into statistical risk assessments. And for example, the FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program uses it to compute coastal flooding risk along much of the U.S. coast, Atlantic and Gulf coasts. More and more we've been trying to do, put it in the forecasting arena, where we're actually trying to predict event-based incidences prior to their occurring, and that really has opened up a kind of a whole new types of issues that one needs to address, and new avenues of research, and it's been fascinating. I will certainly agree with the previous speaker that models by themselves aren't forecasts that are particularly useful. They're information that someone who knows how to interpret them can then communicate with decision makers, and that's by far the most effective way in order to make that happen. I've done a lot of research on the development of AdCirc, the implementation of AdCirc, but I've also had the benefit of working, again, largely with the operational community to see to work on trying to do better than just chuck things over the fence and hope that they'll use them. And clearly that's a challenge on both the researchers' end and the operations users' ends, because they tend to have very different priorities and constraints, and sometimes even perspectives. So with all of that, a few thoughts that I have. Certainly coastal flooding due to coastal storms is a challenging problem of scales, of physical scales. Storms are big, and so in order to model them and their responses accurately, one needs to model large areas. And yet flooding is a very locally controlled problem. A dune line, an elevated roadbed or railroad bed, a natural ridge line, a natural channel, all of that can be the difference between whether you get flooded or not in a particular localized area. And those things aren't typically designed for flood protection or flood mitigation issues. And then, as one designs more and more flood mitigation measures, then those obviously are relevant in that situation as well. So it's really a challenge of how to model that entire problem of scales. The AdCirc model has been successful in this arena largely because it was designed to use unstructured meshes. and so that they can optimize the problem, if you will, and get a high resolution where you need it and less resolution where you don't. And for many years, that's been a sort of a novel approach to these problems. More and more, it's been adopted by others, but it's certainly led the field in terms of implementation and applications. I will say that in the context of this session, it's static and it's preordained, and so it definitely begs the question of, can we do better? And so I think that's certainly one of our challenges. I'll come back to this sort of the precipitation, hydrology, coastal storm surge for a minute. Hurricane Barry, which barely made a hurricane, but it was this summer, and it hit southern Louisiana, was a real interesting event. It wasn't a major surge event. However, it came at the time when the Mississippi River was at unprecedentedly high levels that late into the calendar year. It's oftentimes high early spring, but it was very high into June, July this year. And when Barry came through, there was massive concern that the river was, not that the coastal surge was going to impact the city like Katrina or Rita or typical hurricanes, but rather that the river was going to overflow or overtop the protection systems along the sides of it. And AdCert was run through our center and through our collaborators, and it's in a deterministic and in a scenario-based way was able to show that it was very unlikely, and again, it wasn't impossible, but it was very unlikely that the levees would overflow. New Orleans there wasn't the wholesale evacuation of New Orleans ordered by the mayor, and in turn, as the storm got closer and in fact moved through the area, that turned out to be the right decision. I'd like to say that we knew what we were doing, or that it was a more certain process than it was, but I do think it was an example of using current best science with conversations with some knowledgeable people in the middle to advise decision makers in a way that turned out being a productive decision. All right, so where are we going with this technology? As I said, that was still static. It was preordained. But where we are certainly going is trying to be more in line with what Chris has queued up for the session. One thing we have in hand, and many agencies have in hand, are an awful lot of model runs that have been done for specific purposes in the past. For example, flood insurance program studies. The question, and these required substantial high-performance computing resources and all of that. They end up being large databases. Oftentimes they're state by state, or even the state of Florida, I think, has 4 or 5 of them. So they're oftentimes databases that are in slightly different formats, and certainly in different physical locations. They actually provide a rich source of data and information for future events if they can